Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into emotionally immature parents. And I want to start off by explaining how this is different from last week's episode, which was emotionally abusive parents. So I want to start by differentiating the two because I think it's important to do that.
I'm interested in what you have to say because I'm trying to think of what the difference is. I mean, that's a good place to start. It really is. Yeah.
I think really what it comes down to is maybe more of the intent would be, my guess, or maybe it's just a pattern. I don't know. Maybe there isn't a difference. You tell me if you think there's a difference.
No, I think there's a difference. I think what we're talking about today might be what might be the underlying reason that a parent would be emotionally abusive, which I don't think we really went into that much, maybe at all last week.
We did a little bit.
We talked about unresolved childhood issues.
Right.
It's a lot of it.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have a terrible memory, Liz, of course. I don't know that I remember it going into detail. And so it feels like what we're doing now is kind of going a little bit deeper into what might be the reason. So because I think that as we talk about emotional immaturity, I still think it goes back to childhood issues. But I think what we're doing is we're kind of pulling it apart and looking at pieces.
Yeah.
Which we don't think we necessarily did last week. Is that your recollection of our episode last week?
I think that sounds pretty accurate. I feel like, because abuse is criminal, but being immature is not.
Right. There you go. That's a good distinction. I like that.
And I think the other thing too is another difference is I think we all start out emotionally immature. And the other thing is that we're dynamic through the lifespan. So I'm not the same parent that I was 11 years ago when I started.
Right. And I'm certainly not the same parent that I was.
Well, I would hope not because your kids are adults. But
yeah, but still, I would handle it very differently. Like with my grandkids. I mean, I spend an awful lot of time with my grandchildren when their parents aren't there. So in a way, we're in that role.
Yeah.
Often of the caretaker and the parent, and I handle it very differently than I would have, 30 years ago. So you're right. We're dynamic through the lifespan. Should be. Hopefully we are.
Hopefully, yeah. And I think too, maybe it's easier to move on from being emotionally immature rather than emotionally abusive. So
you're right. I agree with that. That's another difference. You're right.
But there are a lot of similarities because as we're going to go through this list, a lot of them, like if you take, and maybe that's another difference too, is if you take this to an extreme, it's abusive.
Right.
Or it's at the very least, it is problematic. And all of these behaviors that we're going to describe are problematic, which leads me into my disclaimer that I think most, if not all parents have done some of these things at one point or another when we're going through these lists. Because, as parents, and we've said this time and time again, most parents are trying to do the best that they can. Yeah. And no parent has handled every parenting situation perfectly. I mean, we can all, as parents, look back and think of 100 times where it's like, I should have handled that differently, or I should have done that different. And, I think in a lot of ways I was an immature parent. I mean, I was only 20, but I sure did grow up fast.
Your brain's not even finished. I mean, I was too. I had my first child at 23.
Yeah.
Our brains aren't even fully developed.
Right.
And they were trying to be parents. That's crazy.
Yeah, I know, right?
Well, I'm kind of glad my children all did it differently. They were in their late 20s or 30s before they got married and had children. I mentioned a book last week, and I'm going to mention it at the start just because it is so appropriate for what we're talking about. It's called Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Seigel. This kind of highlights the difference between emotionally abusive and emotionally immature, because he talks about his own experience as a young father, and he in like the first chapter, and it's not emotionally abusive in
Yeah.
any way,
Mm-hmm.
but it really comes across that he acknowledges that this experience that he had as a child is emotionally immature.
Yeah.
And so that really is the focus of the book. It's, even though I mentioned it last week in our episode about emotionally abusive parents, it's really more about how do you become an emotionally mature parent. And as I said, it can be hard
Mm-hmm.
for people to read it, but those clients that I've had who've gone through it and really done the exercises have really benefited a lot from it.
Yeah.
And so the important thing about that book, in every single chapter, one of the sections is going to be, I think he calls it the inside out exercise.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the meat of the book. And that's the hard part,
Yeah.
because what he's asking you to do is go back and think about, your own childhood and adolescence and how you were brought up and your experiences in life and how they impact you now as the parent.
Right. It's also hard for us to acknowledge and recognize our own weaknesses. That can be,
Yeah.
we don't like to do that, or we don't like
No.
that. That can be, that can be hard. And one of the things that they mentioned in this article is that it can be hard to recognize weakness in your parents,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we will also have this article that we're going to be referencing listed in our show notes so that you can read the full article for yourself. It was a good article, especially because if you maybe have done some of these behaviors in the past, maybe you are doing some of these behaviors. It's certainly not too late to change, no matter what age your children are. And if you're just starting out, then I think it would be a really good read to avoid, because I don't think you can do any of these behaviors on infants.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an infant, I don't know that it's possible to have any of these behaviors.
Well, I probably disagree, because I think one of the
Okay.
behaviors is being emotionally distant. And
Oh,
in the
okay.
past, what we've talked about is the importance of attachment.
That's true.
And
Okay.
and so
Yeah.
we do know that in some cases where the infant doesn't get that the attachment, which is really about being
Mhm.
emotionally present,
Yeah.
then that causes long-term problems. So I
Hmm.
think that at any age you can be emotionally immature with your children.
This is true. And I want to point out another important distinction here, the difference between emotional immaturity and postpartum depression. We're not going to get too
Oh,
much
right,
in.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we won't dive really into postpartum depression, but that is a difference, because
They are
attachment,
different.
yes, but when attachment can be difficult when you have postpartum depression. And I want to
Right.
acknowledge how vastly and wildly different that is, because it's not emotional immaturity. That's a genuine, well, that's a mental health disorder.
Right. And hopefully,
Mhm.
it's a temporary
Yes.
situation, whereas emotional maturity hopefully would be temporary too, but
Yeah.
probably more long term. Whereas with postpartum depression, hopefully you can get help for that
Yes.
and help bring yourself out of that. I
Hmm.
think there are things you can do that can help you, come out of that. But you're right, they're very different. So we aren't talking about that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this article starts off by explaining a little bit of why this happened. And so there was a quote by, and I'm going to butcher the name, so I apologize, by Aparna Sagaram.
Hmm.
Sagaram. Okay.
I don't know who that is.
Yeah. So, but she's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And she said that an emotionally immature parent is a parent who is unable to meet your emotional needs, either as a kid or an adult child. And I thought that was a pretty good definition of being emotionally immature.
Help me understand that. Is he talking about the parent is unable to meet their own
No,
emotional
unable
needs or their child's emotional needs?
their child's emotional
Okay.
needs. But I
Okay.
think it could be both, honestly, when if you think about it.
Right. I agree. As I thought about doing this, I thought it might be appropriate just to talk about emotional immaturity in general
Okay. Yeah.
without respect to being a parent, because there
Hmm.
are a lot of, well, not a lot, but there are a lot of adults out there who are emotionally immature who
Yeah.
don't have children. But I think as we define emotional immaturity, it's the same.
Hmm.
And so for me, there's some common traits. Impulsive behavior.
Mm.
Now, this gets difficult talking about impulsive behavior because there are parents who have ADHD.
Yeah.
And one of those traits is going to be impulsive behavior. Now, I've seen this in my own. I have an ex-son-in-law who he was a preemie baby, and we know that preemie babies certainly have more ADHD, and he still has a bad case of ADHD, and there are times when he's pretty impulsive. That's hard because what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to help your children learn not to be impulsive because they are. Children, children are naturally impulsive, but I think that's because of brain immaturity. And so it's really important to have a parent who hopefully is not that way because it teaches how to not be impulsive. Right. Demanding attention. I think that there are parents who do that. Name calling, bullying. Avoidance of dealing with issues directly and avoidance of that emotional attachment. I think some parents are narcissistic. We probably talked about this in the few years that we've been doing this at some point. And so again, that's more of, a mental health issue, that narcissism, but it doesn't really have to be a full-blown personality disorder. But I think maybe what we could call it is just being too self-centered, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about yourself. Because I think for me, one of the defining characteristics of being a parent is that you have someone else whose needs and welfare in a lot of ways takes precedent over your own.
Yeah.
And as an adult, we are focused on taking care of and teaching that child. And so if we'll use that term narcissistic or self-centered or egocentric, any number of terms, then you're more focused on your needs and not theirs. And I think that's being emotionally immature.
All right. So one of the other things that this article explains is that emotionally immature parents were raised by emotionally immature parents, and the behavior was modeled. And I think that's also another important issue to discuss, is the fact that we very often, I think, model our own parents' behavior in our parenting styles, right? To some extent.
I think that happens a lot. I think that the only way out of that is to be more self-aware.
Yeah.
But here's the problem with that. Being self-aware requires a certain amount of emotional maturity.
Yeah.
And if you're already emotionally immature, then in a lot of ways, it's less likely that you're going to be that self-aware. So I think you're absolutely right. And the risk is, I think I've said this before, that if we knew perfectly the history of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, all of a sudden all the behavior would make sense.
Right.
We go, okay, now I get it. I think first you just have to be willing to look at how you're parenting and then try and figure out where does that come from. Now, often that comes from a spouse or a partner, who might be there with you, who's probably not emotionally mature. I mean, I think you can get two parents who are, but hopefully, you're with someone, you're partnered with someone who's going to be able to help you see it. But again, that's problematic because if someone points out to you, here's something you might be doing, you might want to think about that. An emotionally immature person is going to be defensive.
Yeah.
It's just really hard because you need that emotional maturity in order to be able to listen to a different point of view or hear the feedback and then take the steps necessary to try and change that. So, when you're emotionally immature and you've seen that modeled in your own family of origin, it's very, very tough to change it.
Yeah, it certainly can't be, but that doesn't mean impossible. I mean, you can break the cycle.
Right. You can break the cycle, but again, you have to be willing to listen, most likely listen to someone else, because I think when you're in the middle of it, let's say you're a single parent, I think it becomes harder because there's no feedback, or there's less feedback. I suppose you can get feedback from friends, about what you might be doing with your kids. But I think it's even a little bit harder if you're a single parent because you're alone.
Yeah.
And so, and I know we talked about this before, but there are many, many excellent single parents.
Yes.
I think that one of the benefits of being in a two-parent family is that you have this feedback. You can Or maybe a check might be the best way to talk about it. You can check each other on your behavior so that if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, you can say, hey, let's talk about this. But I think there are many, many great single parents, and hopefully they work on their emotional maturity.
Right. Yeah, I think it's still entirely possible to do it. It's just, again, I mean, parenting is a hard enough gig in and of itself. And so, doing it on your own, give yourself some grace through the process, right?
Yeah. But I think that one of the hallmarks of emotional immaturity, whether or not your parent, is that lack of self-awareness.
Yeah.
That I think that they don't fully understand their own feelings. And if you don't really understand your own feelings or your own behavior, then it's really, really hard to be an effective parent, because part of our job is to set, adequate, good boundaries, to be a good role model, the discipline, to be a good disciplinarian, not angry, but to be able to set, it goes back to boundaries, to be able to set the boundaries, follow through, have that, we've called it in the past emotion coaching. That's a John Gottman term, that, really keying into the child's emotions.
Yeah.
Now, that would be really tough if you can't key into your own emotions. Then it's going to be very difficult for you to reflect, to see, and then acknowledge the child's emotions and then reflect them. And because that's how we build emotionally immature children, is through that process that Gottman calls emotion coaching. Right?
And I think you bring up another really good point, is you can't help your children be emotionally aware if you yourself aren't.
Right.
If you don't, and a lot of times one thing that you've said before is it's a lack of vocabulary. I think that can fall into emotional immaturity, is just, a lack of adequate words to describe emotions, which can also lead people to believe they don't have emotions.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I have this list that I give clients often, because we think of our emotions in kind of broad terms.
Yeah.
Anger, happiness, joy. But really, once you increase your vocabulary, it makes your emotional world more full, more rich. And I think that's an important thing to be able to teach your children.
Yeah.
And that's just learning, in my mind, taking the effort to learn about emotions, And I give exercises to my clients often about, so here's what it looks like, 3 or 4 times a day, set something on your watch that then prompts you to pull out this list and say, okay, what's going on with me right now? So that you aren't just stuck on, I'm angry, I'm happy, but going down deeper and increasing that vocabulary. And what happens over time, it just becomes part of how you think about yourself. So it's not like you have to stop yourself 5 times a day and check in. I think you do that as you're learning how to increase your vocabulary. But that's one of the ways that an emotionally immature parent, I think, can become emotionally more mature.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I want to, before we dive into this list, I want to just start again and reiterate our disclaimer that we've all been emotionally immature at some point in our lives, and we've all been emotionally mature as a parent, right? I think, we're all learning and growing. Don't sit here and just torture yourself with, oh, I did this that one time and I did this that one time.
Yeah.
If you're recognizing that you did this, that's a sign of emotional maturity and you're doing good.
Right. Because you're being self-aware.
Yes.
So you're absolutely right about that. That if it's the emotionally immature parents who aren't going to recognize, that they have been doing those things.
Yeah. Right. So the first one, emotionally dump on their children. This is a little.
To me, that's a boundary issue.
Yeah. Well, and it also ties really well into the next one. Maybe we can kind of combine them. Is rely on their kids for emotional support.
Right.
They're pretty similar. And, I want to point out that there's a difference between, if you have a good relationship with your child and, and there's something genuinely hard going on in your world and you're sharing that with your child and you're saying, this is a difficulty I'm experiencing. That's different than just, emotionally dumping on your child regularly. Right. So.
Right. But, and you also have to be age appropriate. I mean,
right.
What you say to a 5-year-old is certainly going to be different than what you say to a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
And so I certainly think that in appropriate ways, sharing emotional difficulties can be teaching moments
Mm-hmm.
with your children. I think a lot of it is, if you think of it in terms of a teaching moment, as opposed to I am relying on the child
Yeah.
for that emotional support, then I think that's different,
Yes.
because I think that's how our children learn how to cope, is by seeing how we cope.
Mm-hmm.
But if what you're doing is you're relying on your child to take care of you emotionally,
Yeah.
that that's emotionally immature.
Or if you're looking at it and it's, oh, I need my child to help me feel better.
Yeah,
That's not
yeah.
good.
No, that's not good either, because that puts a really awful burden on the child. We certainly see adults in our office who've experienced that.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult because it flips the roles. I mean,
Yeah.
anytime you flip the role of child and parent, then that's really not good for the child.
I think another distinction too is especially with your child is not an adult, right? So if you have
Mhm.
like a child or a teenager, is if it's in the moment or if they ask, right? So if your child is saying, "Mommy, what's wrong? Why do you look so sad?" Or "Mommy, why are you, what's going on?" If your child notices it, then that's a perfect teaching opportunity. It's very appropriate to say, "Well, I'm feeling this because of what's going on." But if your child just comes into you and you just say, "Oh, I'm just so sad right now," you know, and you just start emotionally vomiting on your child, that's a sign of immaturity.
Yeah, and I think you're right that, say, if the child talks about it or
Yeah.
asks a question, then I think there's a second part to the teaching moment.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm experiencing, and here's what I'm doing to
Mm,
take care of myself or to solve it or something. Here's what
yeah.
I'm doing to handle this. Because then the child learns over time, I can have emotionally difficult experiences and I can take care of myself and come out of those emotionally difficult
Yeah.
experiences. I think what you're teaching your child is resilience at
Mhm.
that time.
Yeah.
But if what you're doing is showing the child that you are helpless,
Mm,
then I think that's a problem.
yeah. Yep.
Or you could even say, I'm going to figure this out. Don't know what to do right now. Again, being age appropriate. But so I don't know that you have to have necessarily a solution. You just have to convey to the child, you're going to figure it out.
Mhm. Yeah.
You're taking care of it and you're going to figure it out.
Right. And again, I think this is different than when if you have an adult child, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Then that because my parents have certainly experienced difficult things
Hmm.
and and not that they completely rely on me, but they've certainly come to me for help in, I guess, getting through something difficult, and to me that feels different,
Yeah.
right? Because
Right.
but again, I have a healthy adult relationship and I want to do that for them, and so it doesn't feel emotionally immature. It's just, I guess, I'm mature enough to handle it. I think that's maybe another
Hmm.
distinction, is the fact that I am emotionally mature. I am mature enough to be able to handle my parents' emotions and I want to help them.
Right.
Okay. So, lack empathy, we kind of talked about this a little bit. So, we'll just briefly mention it again, that it is on this list that, they lack empathy, and this can be full blown narcissistic, don't
Hmm.
have empathy, or it can just be you are too focused on yourself instead of your children.
Well, and also I think it can come from your family of origin where you didn't learn empathy,
That's
because I
true.
think that's where we learn empathy,
Yeah.
is from our parents. And so it goes back to what you said earlier. There's this pattern, you emotionally immature parents were likely raised by
Hmm.
emotionally immature parents. And so somehow you have to be aware, or someone has to point out to you that you might be lacking empathy,
Yeah.
and then figure out, okay, how can I learn how to be more empathetic, which I think you can learn.
Hmm.
I really think that we have, unless you're a sociopath, I think that we have that.
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
in some ways it's just suppressed, or we haven't learned how to express it or how to access it. So
Right.
I want to be clear. I think we all have that capacity
Yeah.
for empathy. We haven't learned what it looks like or how to express it. And I find that with couples all the time, that one or both of them, they want to be empathetic and in some cases they think they are, but they really aren't. And well, there's a lot of things. It's lacking the vocabulary, like you said before, and it's just knowing what does this even look like. So you can learn that. So part of what I do with couples and individuals is teach them, what does this look like? How do you even do this? And so I think it's more of a learned behavior than anything, unless you're a sociopath. So we aren't talking about sociopaths right now.
Nope, we're not. Okay, so the next one we've also briefly touched on is they struggle with boundaries. And I mean, boundaries are so critical for children, right? Developing children, because they are so impulsive. They're not going to set their own boundaries. I mean, I have never met a kid who willingly will go to bed at 8 o'clock every night. I mean, right. And so that's kind of our job as parents, make sure they get adequate sleep, right? And making sure that they're eating good foods, because also a kid will happily eat ice cream every day of their lives multiple times a day and, live a really unhealthy life. And so like, it's struggling with boundaries as a parent, again, is something that we've all done. And it's so hard parenting is so hard. And I think this is the biggest one where we can all look back and say, yeah, I've struggled with setting my boundaries. So in an emotionally immature way, what would that look like for you?
So in Frankie and Jess always used to say that boundaries, this is my favorite word, which I think is true.
Yeah.
But here's how I look at boundaries with kids, is that what you're doing is you're containing them. And you can think of a boundary as you're almost fencing them in behaviorally. But a couple of things are important about that. One, you're helping them. I think it's helpful to learn what the boundaries are, but it also gives children a sense of safety.
Yes.
Because if they know that their parents are in charge and that there is just someone taking care of them, and it doesn't mean that they're always going to go, oh yeah, I'll go to bed at 8:30, or yeah, I won't. I mean, they're going to push against the boundary. That's the normal childhood behavior, and you should expect that. But that doesn't mean that you don't keep the boundary. And so, as the parent, you are keeping that child contained. And then, as they get older, the way I look at it is that boundary gets bigger, and or their world increases. There's still boundaries around it. They're just different, and the child has more freedom and choice. There was the guy, I can't remember, but he called it the V of parenting. I don't know I think I've talked about that.
Yeah.
And, here, our listeners can't see me, but I've got my hands in this V, and down at the bottom, the V, the area inside the V is very small. And that represents the amount of control that at age 0 and very young, the child has very little control. And then as they get older, that V spreads out and the area in the V gets bigger, and meaning they have more control. And to me, that's just a way of talking about the boundaries, that if you're doing it well, you contain your children tightly. I guess that might be the word I'd use, tightly, as they're younger.
Yes.
And then you loosen it up as they get older.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I mean, well, because they need very tight boundaries, because toddlers have zero sense of self-preservation, and they need the tight boundaries so they don't go running into the middle of the street to play.
Right. So I think boundaries are really important.
Yeah. And another interesting thing too that I was thinking about is, if you're an emotionally immature parent and you don't set boundaries for your children, you're not going to respect boundaries when they're adults.
That's right. And I think that as an emotionally immature parent, you may not have very good boundaries yourself. Which you go back to, as far as emotionally dumping on your child or expecting. But, that's as a parent. But I would guess that a lot of emotionally immature people have poor boundaries with other adults as well.
And I think this was something that my mom certainly struggled with, because her mom did not give her any boundaries. She was allowed to do whatever she wanted growing up. In fact, as an adult parent, I think she struggles feeling that she didn't do enough, because I think she sometimes struggled with, I mean, not that she didn't give us boundaries, but I think she struggled with enforcing the boundaries, right? With being consistent with boundaries, because she had no good example. But, again, she really did the best that she could. And I by no means think she did a bad job, but she's also good at respecting boundaries as an adult. So, she was able to evolve and grow past it.
And so the 4 effective steps of parenting that I'll just mention briefly. one, clear expectations, which is,
Yeah.
again, is expectation of what the boundary is.
Yeah.
Is what we're talking about. The second step would be either rewards or consequences for a violation of the boundary, or for holding the boundary, the reward. And then the third and the fourth step, which you just mentioned, which are really difficult for some parents, follow through and being consistent.
Yeah.
Are critical. And because if you're inconsistent, then you're teaching the child that the boundary sometimes is there, sometimes it's not. And we want to raise children who can be good functioning adults. And the world is about boundaries.
Yeah.
You're going to be employed at some point. That's about boundaries. You have to go to work at 8, you leave. There are all these things that you have to do. Relationships, good relationships are about boundaries. So consistency and follow through, those from my experience are the hardest ones for the parents to use, because most people can come up with what the expectation is.
Yeah.
Or the boundary. Some people have trouble with either the reward or the consequence, but a lot of people have trouble with follow through and consistency.
I think all parents struggle with it at one point or another. I mean, I think that's probably the parents' biggest struggle is the consistency and the follow through, because it's hard. It is really hard when your child is incessantly whining and screaming at you because they don't like the boundary in that moment.
Please, Mom, just this one time, please.
Yes.
How many? We've all heard that.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
But as much as you would like to be the one who says, okay, it's really important. The consistency is so important, and it builds trust.
It does.
So I try and help parents understand, because even though your child will be unhappy, they learn to trust you that when you say this is going to happen, it does. And that's a good thing.
You can't be their best friend and their parent. No, it just doesn't work.
You cannot.
Yeah. You cannot. Okay, so use guilt or the silent treatment as a weapon. So this, I think, is an important distinction, because we've all hit that point in parenthood where you just have to stop interacting with the child because the behavior is no longer acceptable.
Well, I call that a timeout, which I think is important.
Right. Well, or like, because I've certainly hit a point with my children where I have said, I am done having this discussion. You have my answer. It's not going to change. You stop interacting. That is
that's different. Yes.
That is very different than just you're mad at your child. And so, 15 minutes later, they've done something to upset you and the moment's moved on and you're still not talking to them or still getting them the silent treatment because you're mad at the way it made you feel.
Yeah,
that is emotionally
immature.
Yeah. Okay, so inconsistent behavior and reactions. This, again, is something that all parents have done at some point, right? I mean, because I think we're all a little bit inconsistent in our behavior and reactions, right? But I think it's different when there's a pattern of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that, as I'm thinking about maybe my own parenting and also the clients that I see, often if there's an increase in stress in your own life, then that can lead to being inconsistent or stronger, most likely stronger reactions than we'd want. But again, in order to realize that there is stress or what's behind the stress, is you have to be somewhat self-aware and to acknowledge. So you're right, we've all done that.
Yeah.
But I think it's not necessarily consistent because it probably occurs more in times of stress for us. And so that just goes back to the importance of self-care, taking care of yourself and realize when you're stressed and what the effect that's going to have on your partner and your children.
Yeah. And so, inconsistent behavior and reactions, I think it's more along the lines of one time your child, maybe they get out of bed, they come out of their room after bedtime, and, you snap at them and you say, no, go back to your room. And then the next time you say, oh, no, it's okay. Right. So like it creates confusion
that's right.
I think it really goes along with boundaries, right? Where you don't set consistent boundaries. You're inconsistent in your boundaries and consequences.
Yeah.
So the next one can also be very difficult, but it can really be a sign of emotional immaturity. And that is, don't respect your individuality. I think this is more of an adult, emotional immature parent thing.
Well, also as you move into adolescence. in late adolescence. That's really one of the tasks of adolescence, is that individuation.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents don't want that, and they want to maintain that control. And I agree, it's one of the hard things. You're just moving into that with your kid,
Yep.
as they start to get older. And at some point, you have to loosen up and let the child be that individual and make mistakes.
Yep.
Because, at least from my perspective, you want them to make the mistakes while they're still in your home.
Yeah.
So that you can be there to help them learn. And so it's also the acceptance that your child is not you.
Yep.
And they're going to have different ideas, different ways to look at the world, and that it's okay. I wanted to raise, really strong individual children, and I did. And sometimes as adults, that makes it not difficult, but my children certainly don't always make the decisions that I think they should, but that's okay. It's their life. It's not my life. It's their life. And so, they're trying to do the best job they can, but that's what we want, is strong individuals. It goes back to that V, or like as a small child, not a lot of individuality. Oh, there's some, but as they get 12, 13, 14, 15, then they're really starting to express their individuality.
Yeah.
And that can be uncomfortable for a lot of parents.
Yeah, it can be, especially if they choose to believe differently than you raised them, which we're going to do an entire episode on here coming up pretty soon.
Yeah.
So boundaries are the antidote to emotional maturity.
That's my favorite word.
Yeah, boundaries. It's all about boundaries.
Well, in relationships. So all we're doing is we're talking about the parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
It can be the same with partners or spouses or with friends, that really it's important to have good boundaries.
Yeah, which is the main takeaway, I think.
Yeah, that's the takeaway.
Boundaries.
Good boundaries and be consistent.
Yeah, boundaries and consistency. Yeah, which consistency is hard. I think it's important to again acknowledge that, because it's by no means easy. But we're all learning and growing.
Yeah.
So I hope that if you are working on your emotional maturity, you're giving yourself grace and patience, because it can definitely be a struggle. But I hope that maybe you're also becoming more self-aware.
It's just, I was going to say, one of the other takeaways is just being self-aware. You have to be self-aware in order to make this work. Yep.
Okay. So next week we are going to get into listener questions. So that's going to be a good episode.
Really interesting questions too. I think around life and transitioning from childhood experiences through adolescence and adulthood. And just different questions related to that.
Yeah, it's going to be a good episode. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.